Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
Why is it that the moment she stops chasing, he suddenly can't stop thinking about her? Not because she played a game. Not because she became mysterious overnight. And honestly, not even because he suddenly realized he loved her. Sometimes it's much less romantic than that. Sometimes he only notices what she meant after the emotional noise disappears. After the good morning texts stop. After no one asks if he got home safely. After her energy, the quiet thing he assumed would always be there, is no longer reaching for him. I've watched this happen more times than I want to admit. Sometimes from the outside. Sometimes from inside my own mistakes. And here's the uncomfortable part. The obsession rarely begins when she's still available. It begins when she finally remembers that her life belongs to her. There wasn't a dramatic goodbye. No long message explaining everything she had finally realized. No speech about self-worth. No final argument where she slammed the door and said, "You'll regret this." Honestly, if you had looked at her life from the outside, you probably wouldn't have noticed anything had changed. She still went to work. Still bought groceries. Still forgot to move the laundry from the washer into the dryer until it smelled slightly damp. Still laughed at videos that had nothing to do with him. It wasn't her life that changed first. It was where her attention lived. And that's the part almost nobody sees. Because reclaiming your energy doesn't look dramatic. Most of the time, it looks boring. It looks like not checking your phone every 7 minutes. It looks like finishing an entire movie without wondering whether he's going to text. It looks like waking up and realizing, "Oh, I didn't think about him immediately this morning." Then feeling guilty for even noticing that. I've watched women mistake this moment for giving up. It isn't. Giving up feels heavy. This feels strangely light. Confusingly light. Like carrying a backpack for months without realizing how much it weighed, until someone quietly takes it off your shoulders. At first your back still leans forward because it's expecting the weight. Then your body slowly remembers. I don't have to hold this anymore. Relationships are funny that way. Sometimes your body lets go before your heart catches up. Sometimes your heart lets go while your habits are still hanging around. She still opened Instagram. His profile still appeared near the top. Her thumb paused. Not because she desperately wanted to look anymore. More because her muscles had memorized the movement. Almost like driving home from work and accidentally taking the old route after you've moved. Habit. Nothing more. She stared at his profile picture for maybe 3 seconds. Then locked her phone. Not because she was trying to prove something. She just didn't have anything she wanted to know anymore. That surprised her more than anyone else. He didn't notice that day. Of course he didn't. People rarely notice when someone quietly stops carrying them emotionally. Because everything still feels comfortable. He still received fewer questions, but enough to think nothing was wrong. She still replied. Just. Not immediately. She wasn't timing it. That part matters. She wasn't sitting there thinking, "I'm going to make him wait." She simply wasn't arranging her entire nervous system around his notifications anymore. She answered after finishing dinner. Or after showering. Or after she finished laughing with a coworker. Life slowly became life again. Not a waiting room. And somehow, that tiny shift reached him before any words ever could. He couldn't explain it. Most men can't. They'll say things like, "You've been different lately." Or, "Everything okay?" Sometimes they'll even accuse her of pulling away. Which is strange. Because often she's doing less pulling than she's done in months. She's simply stopped overreaching. There's a difference. A huge one. I remember a conversation with someone years ago. He kept insisting. "I don't know why she's changed." What changed? I don't know. She just feels Farther away. Were you talking less? No. Fighting more? No. Seeing each other less? No. So what changed? He sat there for a long time, staring into his coffee, turning the paper sleeve around the cup with his fingers. Finally, he shrugged. I don't know. It just feels like that she doesn't need me the same way. That sentence stayed with me. Because I don't think what frightened him was losing her attention. I think what frightened him was realizing it had never actually belonged to him. She had been choosing him. Every day. Over and over. He mistook choice for permanence. A lot of us do. There's something quietly heartbreaking about people who assume love is permanent simply because it has been consistent. Consistency becomes invisible. Like electricity. You only notice it after the lights go out. Not because the electricity changed. Because your awareness finally did. Meanwhile, she wasn't sitting at home plotting emotional consequences. She was trying to remember what she actually enjoyed before every free moment became emotionally occupied. She bought flowers for her apartment. Not expensive ones. The cheap grocery store flowers that usually start drooping after 4 or 5 days. She almost didn't buy them. Then she heard herself thinking, no one's going to see these. And immediately laughed. Why did someone else need to see them? She couldn't remember. That realization embarrassed her a little. Not because buying flowers was profound. Because she'd accidentally admitted to herself how much of her life had become performative. Tiny things. Sending pictures of sunsets. Waiting before eating dinner. Saving funny stories specifically to tell him later. Even happiness had started asking for permission. Now, she ate while the food was hot. Around the same time, he noticed something equally small. She stopped sending random updates. No more. This dog reminded me of you. No more blurry grocery aisle photos. No voice note laughing because she couldn't pronounce something. Nothing dramatic disappeared. Just the ordinary intimacy. Most people think relationships collapse because of huge betrayals. Sometimes they erode because ordinary moments quietly stop traveling between two people. That's harder to notice. Harder to explain. But somehow, it hurts more. He checked his phone one afternoon during work. Nothing. Again 20 minutes later. Still nothing. By evening he found himself opening their conversation. Not to text. Just to look. He scrolled upward. Past old memes. Past pictures of food neither of them remembered eating. Past conversations that once felt insignificant. He smiled at one message. She had corrected his spelling months ago. He'd rolled his eyes back then. Now he laughed. Then immediately felt strange for laughing alone. He locked the phone. Put it face down. Picked it up 30 seconds later. Closed it again. It wasn't panic. Not yet. It was something much quieter. His emotional autopilot had reached for something. And found empty air. Why am I checking? He asked himself. You wanted space. I know. So enjoy it. I am. Are you? Silence. The kind that answers the question without saying a word. This is the part people misunderstand. He wasn't obsessed. Not yet. He wasn't even fully aware that he missed her. His ego translated everything into irritation first. Why is she so quiet? Why does she seem busy lately? Why isn't she asking where I am? Is she trying to prove something? Sometimes pride invents explanations because the truth feels too vulnerable. Because saying, I think I miss the way she quietly existed in my day, feels much more dangerous than saying, she's acting weird. She, meanwhile, almost texted him one night. Not because she wanted to reopen everything. She simply saw something funny. Her fingers even typed his name. Then stopped. Not out of discipline. Not because some relationship coach would have been proud. She genuinely asked herself, "Do I actually want to send this?" She waited. About 10 seconds. Then quietly whispered, "No." Not angrily. Not dramatically. Just honestly. That honesty surprised her. She wasn't withholding herself. There just wasn't the same impulse anymore. It's amazing how different those two things feel. One is exhausting. The other is peaceful. And that's usually the exact moment the emotional balance begins to shift. Not because she's becoming unavailable. Not because she's finally learned the right psychological strategy. Life isn't that neat. It's because something invisible has changed. The emotional current that had been flowing mostly in one direction begins returning home. No announcement. No celebration. No revenge. Just a woman slowly remembering that her thoughts are allowed to belong to her. That her mornings don't have to begin with waiting. That her evenings don't have to end with wondering. That love, even real love, was never supposed to require abandoning the rest of her life. And maybe that's why he feels it before he understands it. Because people notice when someone stops reaching for them, even if they never noticed how often that person had been reaching in the first place. Not immediately. Not dramatically. Just enough for a quiet thought to appear while driving home. Or lying awake at 2 a.m. Or staring at a phone that hasn't buzzed in hours. Something feels different. He can't name it yet. He probably won't for a while. But somewhere beneath the explanations, beneath the pride, beneath the excuses, a very small part of him has already begun looking toward the place where her attention used to be. And for the first time, it isn't waiting there anymore. At first, the silence feels like relief. That's the part almost nobody wants to admit. Especially men. Especially the ones who genuinely cared, but were also quietly overwhelmed. Because emotional overwhelm doesn't always feel like sadness. Sometimes it feels like too many unread messages. Too many expectations, real or imagined. Too many conversations that require an emotional vocabulary you don't think you have. Too many moments where someone looks at you hoping you'll explain what's happening inside your own chest. When you honestly have no idea. So he says the sentence. The sentence so many women remember years later. "I just need some space." He says it carefully. Sometimes gently. Sometimes clumsily. Sometimes over text because saying it face to face makes his stomach hurt. Sometimes after an argument. Sometimes after an incredibly intimate weekend that somehow scared him more than any fight ever could. That's one of the strangest contradictions I've ever seen. Some men pull away after conflict. Others pull away after feeling too close. Because closeness asks questions they don't know how to answer. Not out loud, anyway. He tells himself this is the mature thing to do. I don't want to hurt her. I need to clear my head. I've got a lot going on. Some of those reasons are even true. That's what makes it complicated. People always want one villain. One liar. One manipulator. Real life is usually much messier than that. Sometimes he honestly believes distance will make everything easier. And for a little while, it does. His phone becomes quieter. No emotionally loaded conversations. No wondering whether he said the wrong thing. No feeling guilty because he forgot to reply for 6 hours. He breathes. He sleeps better. At least. For 2 or 3 days. Maybe a week. He tells himself, this is what I needed. Then something strange begins happening. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just small interruptions. Tiny emotional glitches. He's driving home after work. A song comes on. Not even their song. Just one she happened to sing badly once while making dinner. She couldn't remember the lyrics. She replaced half the words with complete nonsense. He laughed so hard he almost dropped the plate he was drying. At the time, it barely registered. Just another ordinary Tuesday. Now, He changes the station. But somehow the silence inside the car feels louder than the music did. Another day. He walks into a grocery store. Someone in the next aisle laughs. For half a second. His body reacts before his mind does. He actually turns around. His chest lifts. His eyes start searching. It isn't her. Just someone with a similar laugh. He immediately feels embarrassed. Not because anyone noticed. Because he noticed. That was weird. He grabs cereal he didn't even come there to buy. Leaves without half the things on his list. Doesn't think about why. It's funny how the body remembers people before the mind gives itself permission to. We act like emotions are logical. Most of them aren't. Most of them arrive disguised as habits. Or muscle memory. Or reaching for your phone at exactly 8:14, because that's usually when she used to text good night after getting home from work. Your fingers unlock the screen before your brain even forms the thought. Nothing's there. You lock it again. I wanted space. His mind repeats it like a legal argument. So why am I checking? No answer. The strange thing about silence is that it changes shape. At first it's empty. Then eventually, it starts talking. Not with words. With absence. He notices he has no one to send random pictures to. Not because he doesn't have friends. Friends aren't usually the people you send a crooked parking job to with the caption, "Look at this disaster." She was. He sees a restaurant they'd planned to try. He walks past it. Keeps walking. Then catches himself thinking, "We never made it there." He immediately gets irritated. Why am I even thinking about this? Because irritation feels safer than grief. There's another thing that happens. It's small. Almost embarrassing. He starts checking whether she's online. Not because he's planning to message. He's just curious. The green dot isn't there. Maybe she's busy. Maybe she turned it off. Maybe she doesn't care. His brain starts writing stories. He hates that. He tells himself he doesn't. But he does. One night he opens the conversation. Types. Deletes. Types again. Deletes again. The message isn't even emotional. It's something stupid. "You still have my hoodie, LOL. Delete. How've you been? Delete. Saw something that reminded me of you. Delete." He throws the phone onto the couch. Almost aggressively. As if the phone is the problem. 5 minutes later. He picks it back up. Text her. No. Why not? Because she wanted space too. No. I was the one who asked for space. So now what? I don't know. That last sentence. I don't know. It's probably the most honest thing he'll think all week. Because this is where masculine pride becomes exhausting. He misses her. But admitting that feels like admitting he made a mistake. And mistakes are uncomfortable when they involve another person's heart. Especially if you were the one who walked away first. So instead, he intellectualizes everything. Maybe we're incompatible. Maybe this was inevitable. Maybe we're just different people. Maybe timing. Maybe stress. Maybe work. Maybe. Sometimes maybe is just fear wearing expensive clothes. Meanwhile, she's experiencing something completely different. Not easier. Just different. The first few nights are hard. Really hard. She reaches for her phone several times. She almost sends him a video. Almost asks how his day went. Almost tells him about the customer who accidentally called her by the wrong name 3 times. Then she remembers. He wanted space. So she puts the phone down. The apartment feels unusually quiet. The refrigerator hums. A neighbor upstairs drops something heavy. She makes tea she forgets to drink. Eventually it goes cold. She pours it out. Makes another cup. This one she actually finishes. Little by little. The evenings become survivable. Not because she stops caring. Because the body slowly adapts to the absence. Humans are heartbreakingly adaptable. We don't always want to be. But we are. Weeks pass. She starts filling the silence with herself. Reading. Calling her sister. Taking longer walks after work. Listening to podcasts without constantly pausing them every time her phone vibrates. Life begins occupying the space where waiting used to live. She doesn't notice the exact day it happens. Nobody ever does. One afternoon she realizes. She hasn't checked whether he's viewed her story. She actually laughs. Not because she's over him. Because she'd forgotten that used to matter. At exactly the same time, his silence begins changing. It no longer feels spacious. It feels echoey. That's the closest word I can find. Echoey. Like living in a house after someone moves out. Everything is still there. The couch. The dishes. The routine. But the sound bounces differently. You don't notice another person's presence every minute they're there. You notice the shape they leave behind. He stays busy. Works later. Goes to the gym more often. Accepts invitations he'd normally decline. Everyone around him assumes he's doing great. He almost believes it himself. Then one Friday night, he gets home. Throws his keys into the bowl near the door. The apartment is spotless. The laundry is folded. The dishes are done. There's absolutely nothing demanding his attention. And suddenly, there's nowhere left to hide. He sits on the edge of the bed. Doesn't even turn the television on. Just sits there. It's uncomfortable how loud your own thoughts become when life finally stops distracting you. I asked for this. He whispers. Did he? Partly. And the rest? That I was scared. Of her? No. Then what? A long pause. So, what? How much I was starting to need her. That realization doesn't feel romantic. It feels humiliating. Because needing someone can feel dangerous when you've spent years convincing yourself that independence is the safest way to live. Here's something people don't talk about enough. Sometimes men don't leave because they feel nothing. Sometimes they leave because they feel too much. And they don't trust themselves with feelings they can't organize. So they mistake distance for clarity. They think, if I step away, I'll finally know what I want. Sometimes distance does create clarity, but not in the direction they expected. Instead of proving they don't care, it quietly reveals how much of their emotional life had become intertwined with someone they insisted they could live without. Not because they couldn't survive. People survive heartbreak every day. That's not the point. The point is that survival isn't the same thing as peace. And somewhere between the quiet apartment, the unsent messages, the random laugh in a grocery store, the empty passenger seat during late-night drives, and the conversations that never happened, the space he thought would free him, slowly became the very thing he couldn't stop carrying. Not because she was chasing him anymore. She wasn't. Not because she disappeared. She didn't. But because silence has a strange way of becoming unbearably heavy. Once the person who used to fill it has finally stopped trying, there's a kind of love that slowly becomes invisible. Not because it disappears. Because it becomes routine. You stop noticing the person who remembers your mother's birthday before you do. The one who notices you've gone quiet and asks, "Everything okay?" before you've even admitted something feels off. The one who gently changes the subject when you're irritated, just to keep the evening from turning into another unnecessary argument. The one who knows which version of your silence means you're tired, and which version means you're hurting. It doesn't look extraordinary. In fact, it often looks so ordinary that people stop seeing it altogether. Until it isn't there anymore. She used to carry emotional weight he never realized he had handed to her. Not intentionally. Most people don't wake up thinking, I'm going to make someone else responsible for regulating my emotions today. It happens gradually. One small habit at a time. He had a stressful meeting. She asked how it went. He barely answered. She understood anyway. He forgot to text all afternoon. She didn't make a scene. She simply smiled when he finally replied at 9:30 p.m. He arrived frustrated after work. She softened her own mood, so his wouldn't get worse. He canceled plans because he was exhausted. She reassured him. It's okay. We'll do it another time. Little by little. She became the emotional cushion between him and the world. The strange part, neither of them noticed. Because when someone catches your emotional fall often enough, you eventually stop realizing you're falling. Then one day, she quietly stopped doing it. Not because she became cold. Not because she wanted revenge. Because she became tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't live in your body. It lives in your attention. The constant monitoring. Is he okay? Did I upset him? Should I text first? Should I wait? Is he stressed? Maybe that's why he's distant. Maybe I should be more patient. Maybe I should understand better. Maybe. Eventually, she noticed something uncomfortable. Almost every thought she had about the relationship started with him. Very few started with herself. That realization didn't make her angry. It made her sad. She was sitting in traffic one afternoon when it happened. Nothing dramatic. Just a red light. Rain tapping softly against the windshield. The radio playing quietly. She caught herself rehearsing another conversation in her head. If he says this, I'll say this. Maybe I should explain it differently. Maybe if I don't sound emotional. Maybe if I use different words. The light turned green. The cars began moving. And suddenly, she heard herself whisper something she'd never said before. I'm tired. Not tired of him. Tired of carrying conversations that hadn't even happened yet. That's when something shifted. Not overnight, but permanently. She stopped trying to predict his moods. Stopped decoding one-word texts. Stopped analyzing punctuation. Stopped wondering whether okay meant something different from okay, without the period. It sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud. But people in emotionally uncertain relationships know exactly what I'm talking about. You become fluent in imaginary languages. You study response times. You notice changes in emoji use. You replay phone calls looking for hidden meanings. You become an investigator in a mystery that probably doesn't even exist. It's exhausting. When she stopped doing that, something interesting happened. Nothing happened. The sky didn't fall. The relationship didn't immediately explode. Life simply continued. She answered when she had time. If he seemed distant, she let him be distant. If he wanted to talk, she talked. If he didn't, she didn't chase clarity. She stopped rescuing conversations every time they began sinking. At first, he appreciated it, although he wouldn't have described it that way. He just felt less pressure, more freedom, more breathing room. The irony is almost painful, because what he thought was freedom was actually the disappearance of emotional labor he'd never realized someone else had been doing. There's a difference between peace and someone quietly absorbing your chaos. From the outside, they can feel exactly the same, until one disappears. A few days later, he had a terrible afternoon. Work went badly. Someone criticized a project he'd spent weeks finishing. Traffic was awful. His coffee spilled across the passenger seat. Normally, by the time he got home, she would have somehow made everything feel smaller. Not by solving anything. Just by existing. She'd ask, "What happened?" He'd shrug. She'd wait. Eventually he'd tell her. Halfway through the story, he'd already feel lighter. Not because the problem disappeared. Because someone had witnessed it. People underestimate what it means to feel witnessed. That evening, she simply said, "I'm sorry today was rough." Then returned to the book she was reading. Not rudely. Not dismissively. She listened. She cared. But she didn't spend the next 3 hours emotionally rebuilding his evening. She didn't abandon herself to repair his mood. For the first time, his emotions stayed where they started. With him. He couldn't explain why that felt unfamiliar. Later that night, he found himself pacing the apartment. Restless. Not angry. Just unsettled. Normally she would have asked another question. Normally she'd keep the conversation alive. Normally she'd notice he was still thinking. Instead, she kissed him goodnight. Rolled over. Fell asleep. He stared at the ceiling. It wasn't that she loved him less. She simply trusted him to carry emotions that had always belonged to him. That trust felt strangely uncomfortable. I've seen this happen more times than I can count. The person who always manages the emotional atmosphere eventually stops. Not dramatically. They just stop compensating. Suddenly, every unresolved feeling becomes visible. Not because new problems appeared. Because the invisible janitor stopped cleaning them up overnight. The next weekend, they met friends for dinner. Something small happened. One of his friends teased him. Normally, she would have laughed, touched his arm under the table, shifted the conversation somewhere safer. She had always been incredibly good at smoothing rough edges. This time, she simply smiled. The conversation continued naturally. He noticed the awkwardness much more than anyone else did. Driving home, he asked, "You've been kind of quiet lately." She looked out the window for a second. Streetlights slid across the glass. Then she answered gently, "I don't think I'm quieter. I think I'm just talking less when there's nothing I actually want to say." He didn't know why that answer bothered him. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't cruel. It was honest. Sometimes honesty feels heavier than criticism. Over the next few weeks, he began experiencing something he'd never really dealt with before. His own emotional weather. Without someone constantly helping regulate it. Stress lasted longer. Loneliness stayed later into the evening. Small disappointments felt bigger. Not because life became harder. Because another person's quiet emotional work had disappeared. She, meanwhile, was rediscovering pieces of herself she'd misplaced. She started saying yes to invitations she'd normally decline. She signed up for a Saturday pottery class. She was terrible at it. Every bowl leaned sideways. One completely collapsed while she was trying to shape it. Everyone laughed. Including her. Months earlier, she would have taken a picture and immediately thought, "I can't wait to show him." This time, she simply laughed because it was funny. The moment belonged entirely to her. And there was something strangely peaceful about that. Not lonely. Peaceful. There's a difference. He noticed the difference before he understood the reason. She no longer entered every room already tuned into his emotional frequency. She entered as herself. If she had a good day, she stayed in a good mood. If he had a bad one, she cared. But she didn't automatically inherit it. That change was almost invisible. Yet it altered everything. Because he'd grown used to someone unconsciously adjusting themselves around him. Now, she remained emotionally separate. Still loving. Still kind. But separate. Healthy people call this boundaries. People who have grown accustomed to emotional caretaking often mistake it for distance. One evening, he caught himself waiting for her to ask a question she'd asked almost every night. "Are you okay?" She never asked. Not because she didn't care. Because if he wasn't okay, she believed he could tell her. Hours passed. Finally, he sighed. I had a really bad day. She looked up immediately. Oh, I'm sorry. What happened? He told her. She listened carefully, held his hand. Then after he finished, she squeezed his fingers and said, That sounds really hard. Silence followed. He waited, instinctively expecting her to rescue the feeling, to solve it, to reassure him that everything would be okay. Instead, she simply stayed beside him. No fixing, no carrying, no emotional lifting. Just presence. Oddly enough, that felt harder. Because now there was nowhere to place emotions except inside himself. It took him weeks to understand what was changing. He kept thinking, she's different. But she wasn't. Not really. She still laughed the same way. Still forgot where she left her keys. Still cried during documentaries about old couples. Still reached for his hand while crossing busy streets. The woman hadn't disappeared. The unpaid emotional job had. And that's what he had mistaken for love. Not because he was selfish. Because he'd never separated the two. He had confused being cared for with being emotionally carried. Only when she stopped managing the invisible parts of his inner world did he begin noticing how much of that world she had quietly been holding all along. And for the first time, he wasn't just missing her attention. He was beginning to miss the emotional home he'd never realized she'd been building around him. One ordinary day after another. People often imagine losing someone as a single moment. A goodbye. A packed suitcase. A blocked number. A final conversation where both people cry and say everything they were too afraid to say before. Real life is usually quieter. Sometimes, you don't lose a person. You lose a version of them. And somehow, that hurts even more. Because the person is still standing right there. They're still answering your texts. Still smiling when they see you. Still asking how your parents are doing. Still remembering that you hate mushrooms on pizza. Everything looks familiar. Yet something you can't quite name has quietly vanished. At first, he tells himself he's imagining it. Maybe she's just busy. Maybe work has been stressful. Maybe she's tired. Maybe he's overthinking. He laughs at himself. You've been watching too many relationship videos. But then the little things keep happening. And little things are difficult to argue with. One Saturday morning, he wakes up before she does. Normally, when she hears him moving around the apartment, she'd wander into the kitchen a few minutes later. Hair messy. Still half asleep. Steal a sip of his coffee before making her own. Complain that he always makes it stronger than she likes. She'd lean against the counter while he cooked eggs. They wouldn't even talk that much. Just exist together. It had become so ordinary that he'd stopped noticing how comforting it was. That morning, she doesn't come into the kitchen. She's sitting on the balcony instead. Wrapped in a sweater. Reading. Her coffee already made. She looks peaceful. He watches her through the sliding glass door for a second. Then something odd happens. He feels left out. Not because she's excluding him. Because she no longer seems to be waiting for him to begin her morning. He joins her outside. What are you reading? She smiles. Shows him the cover. He nods. She goes back to reading. No awkwardness. No tension. Just contentment. For some reason. That unsettles him. Later he'll struggle to explain why. He'll tell himself. She seems different. But what he's really noticing is that she's becoming complete in moments that no longer include him. There was a time when every interesting thing she saw became something to share with him. A funny dog wearing tiny rain boots. A bakery shaped like a train station. A strange cloud that looked like a whale. She'd take pictures without thinking. Not because she needed validation, because sharing joy had become her instinct. Now, she still notices beautiful things. She simply experiences them before thinking about who to send them to. Sometimes, she never sends them at all. That's not withdrawal. That's presence. She's becoming more present in her own life. Ironically, he experiences it as absence. I've always found that fascinating. One person's healing can feel like another person's rejection. Not because healing is cruel, because it changes patterns people unknowingly depended on. He starts noticing she laughs more often. Not always with him. She comes home from lunch with coworkers smiling. She tells stories. Mentions someone named Olivia from accounting. Or the older woman from pottery class who insists every failed bowl has personality. She laughs. Really laughs. The kind where she has to stop talking halfway through because she's smiling too hard. He catches himself thinking something he immediately feels guilty for. When did she become this happy? The honest answer? She always had the ability. She had simply spent so much emotional energy trying to hold the relationship together that she'd forgotten how much of herself existed outside of it. One evening, they're watching television together. A scene comes on that reminds him of an inside joke they used to have. Without thinking, he turns toward her, ready to make the joke, ready to hear her laugh before he even finishes the sentence. She smiles politely. For a second, she doesn't remember. Then she does. Oh, I forgot about that. She laughs softly. But it's different. Not fake. Just older. Like opening a box filled with photographs from another apartment. The memory is still warm. It simply no longer lives in today's house. That tiny hesitation hits him harder than he expects. Because memories fade quietly. No announcement. No warning. One day, someone no longer remembers the joke before you explain it. He begins trying harder. Nothing dramatic. He sends her memes during the day. Suggests restaurants. Asks if she wants to go for a drive. Months ago, she would have canceled almost anything just to spend more time together. Now, sometimes she says, I already made plans. Not defensively. Not to make him jealous. Simply because she actually has plans. She says it so naturally that it catches him off guard. Oh, what are you doing? I'm meeting Emma. We're trying that little bookstore cafe. You want to come? The invitation is genuine. Yet somehow, he doesn't want to go. Because he doesn't actually want the cafe. He wants the version of her who would have immediately chosen him instead. He doesn't realize that's what he's mourning. Not yet. Loss is strange. Sometimes. It arrives before separation ever does. That night, he scrolls through old photos on his phone. Vacation pictures. Random selfies. A blurry image of her asleep on the couch with popcorn spilled across her sweater. He smiles. Then something catches his attention. Almost every photo had been taken by her. She had documented so much of their life. Not because she was obsessed with pictures. Because she genuinely believed ordinary moments deserved remembering. He realizes something uncomfortable. There haven't been many new photos lately. Not because they stopped spending time together. Because she stopped trying to preserve every shared moment. She's living them instead. Or sometimes, living something else entirely. He doesn't tell anyone this. But he begins revisiting old conversations. Not to read the words. To remember how she sounded. He scrolls months back. Voice notes. Photos. Tiny arguments that now seem almost funny. He notices patterns he'd never seen before. She always apologized first. Even when she wasn't entirely wrong. She always reopened conversations after disagreements. She always checked in after long silences. She always reached. Again. 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 He reaches the present day. The conversation feels lighter, shorter, cleaner. No emotional essays. No paragraphs trying to explain herself. No desperate attempts to repair distance. At first glance, it looks healthier. Maybe it is. But he can't shake the feeling that something important disappeared. What disappeared was her willingness to chase connection when he wasn't meeting her halfway. One afternoon, he calls her. She doesn't answer. No big deal. She's probably busy. 20 minutes later, she calls back. Sorry, I was in the middle of something. Months ago. He would have expected an explanation. Who she was with. What happened. Why she couldn't answer. Instead, that's all she says. He realizes. He doesn't actually need more information. He just became accustomed to receiving it. She isn't hiding anything. She's simply no longer over-explaining her existence. Healthy people don't usually do that. Anxious people often do. She has slowly stopped being anxious. He experiences that change as distance. Another weekend. They visit a local market. She wanders ahead, stopping to smell candles, trying homemade jam samples, talking to an elderly vendor about handmade ceramics. He watches from a few steps behind. She looks lighter. There's a softness in the way she moves. She isn't checking every few seconds to see whether he's enjoying himself. She isn't monitoring his expression. She isn't adjusting her pace around his mood. She's simply there, present, curious, alive. He suddenly realizes something that lands in his chest almost like grief. He had forgotten this version of her existed. Maybe he'd never truly met her. Not because she'd hidden herself. Because she'd gradually reshaped herself around his emotional gravity. Now, without trying, she has drifted back into her own orbit. That realization follows him home. He sits in the car for several minutes after parking. Engine off. Hands resting on the steering wheel. Thinking. Not about leaving. Not even about fixing anything. Just thinking. When did she stop needing me? The question hurts. But after sitting with it for a while, another question quietly replaces it. Did she ever actually need me? Or did she simply choose me? There's a painful difference. Need feels permanent. Choice has to be renewed. Again. And again. And again. He'd mistaken years of her choosing him for something automatic. As though love, once given enough times, became guaranteed. It doesn't. Love isn't maintained by memory. It's maintained by participation. That evening, she falls asleep first. A book resting on her chest. Her reading glasses slightly crooked. He carefully removes the book. Places it on the bedside table. Pulls the blanket over her shoulder. She murmurs something he can't quite understand. Then settles back into sleep. He watches her for a long moment. She looks exactly the same. The same face. The same freckles. The same tiny wrinkle near her left eye when she smiles. Nothing has changed. Except everything. Because the woman lying beside him is no longer the one who organizes her entire emotional world around whether he notices her. She has quietly become someone who notices herself. And that's the version he never expected to lose. Not because she walked away. Not because she stopped loving. But because while he assumed she would always remain exactly where he'd left her, she kept living. She kept healing. She kept becoming. And somewhere along the way, the version of her that waited, the version that explained, the version that reached first, the version that built her days around the possibility of his attention, slowly disappeared. Not in anger. Not in revenge. Simply because people cannot remain suspended in emotional waiting forever. Eventually, They return home to themselves. And when they do, the people who love them without fully seeing them often look up in quiet disbelief, wondering where she went. Without realizing, she didn't disappear at all. She simply became someone they never thought they would have to earn again. If you asked him directly how he felt, he would have given you a perfectly reasonable answer. I'm fine. We've both changed. Life goes on. It is what it is. He genuinely believed those words. At least, his mind did. His body had a completely different opinion. That's the strange thing about attachment. The brain can create explanations long before the nervous system catches up. Logic moves quickly. The body moves honestly. He decided he was going to move forward. Not because he stopped caring, because admitting how much he cared felt far more dangerous. So he made a plan. He worked later, accepted more invitations, started going to the gym consistently again, downloaded a meditation app, cleaned the apartment, reorganized his closet. He even joked to a friend, "I think I'm finally getting my life together." His friend smiled. "Good. You needed this." He nodded. "I know." And for a few hours, he almost believed it. Then he walked into a grocery store. Nothing emotional had happened that day. He wasn't thinking about her. He wasn't sad. He simply turned into the cereal aisle and froze. There, on the second shelf, was the ridiculous granola she always insisted tasted better than every other brand. He used to tease her constantly. "Nobody actually likes this." She'd laugh. "You just have bad taste." Without thinking, his hand reached toward the box, then stopped halfway. He stared at it longer than anyone should stare at breakfast cereal. Finally, he walked away. But the feeling stayed. It wasn't about granola. It was about how ordinary objects had quietly memorized someone. This became a pattern. A blue sweater in a store window. The smell of jasmine tea drifting out of a cafe. Someone laughing across a parking lot with the exact rhythm she had when something genuinely surprised her. His mind wasn't trying to remember her. His nervous system simply kept recognizing pieces of a life they had shared. People often imagine obsession as constant thinking. Sometimes, it's constant recognizing. He hated that, because it made him feel weak. His ego had already decided the story was over. His body kept reading from earlier chapters. One Friday evening, his co-workers invited him out. A crowded restaurant. Music too loud. Everyone talking over one another. He laughed. Ordered another drink. Participated in conversations. From the outside, he looked completely present. Then someone asked, "Anybody seeing anyone these days?" A few people answered. One man talked about a first date. Someone else mentioned getting engaged. Eventually, the question reached him. He shrugged casually. "Not really." "You?" One coworker grinned. "I've got someone you should meet." He smiled politely. "Maybe." Everyone moved on. The conversation continued. Nobody noticed that something inside him had quietly tightened. Not because he wanted to get back together. Because imagining someone new felt strangely impossible. He couldn't explain why. The space beside her in his emotional life hadn't become empty. It had become unavailable. Weeks earlier, he would have called that ridiculous. Now, he simply stopped arguing with the feeling. That night, he got home later than usual. The apartment was quiet. He tossed his keys onto the kitchen counter. Changed clothes. Brushed his teeth. Everything normal. Everything routine. He climbed into bed. Reached across the mattress. For absolutely no reason. His hand landed on cold sheets. He closed his eyes. The body remembers habits that the mind considers insignificant. Where someone usually sleeps. How they breathe. the warmth that slowly builds beneath shared blankets. The tiny shift in the mattress when another person turns over during the night. None of these memories require conscious thought. They're stored somewhere deeper. He rolled over, trying to ignore it. Sleep took much longer than usual. The next morning, he woke from a dream. He couldn't remember the conversation, only the feeling. In the dream, they had been grocery shopping, arguing over apples, laughing, completely ordinary. He sat on the edge of the bed for several minutes, confused. Why would his mind choose something so small? Because attachment rarely misses the dramatic moments first. It misses the ordinary ones. The extraordinary memories become stories. The ordinary memories become home. His ego still fought back. Every single day. You need to move on. You're romanticizing everything. It wasn't perfect. Remember all the problems. And his mind agreed. Yes. They had problems. Miscommunication. Different expectations. Emotional exhaustion. None of that was imaginary. He wasn't idealizing the relationship. He knew exactly why it became difficult. But knowing why something ended doesn't automatically remove the emotional imprint it left behind. There's a misconception that healing happens through deciding, as though one morning you simply wake up and choose indifference. Real healing rarely works that way. You can decide to stop calling someone. You cannot decide to stop recognizing their favorite song after hearing the first 3 notes. The nervous system has no respect for deadlines. One afternoon, he accidentally opened an old photo while looking for a receipt on his phone. She was sitting on the floor assembling a bookshelf. Instruction manual upside down. Hair falling into her face. Completely convinced she knew what she was doing. He remembered laughing because she'd attached one shelf backward. She insisted it was modern design. He smiled, then quickly closed the picture. A few seconds later, he opened it again. Not intentionally. Almost reflexively. He zoomed in. Not on her. On the background. Trying to remember that apartment. The sunlight. The rug they argued about buying. The coffee mug sitting on the windowsill. Memory is strange. Sometimes, you aren't trying to return to a person. You're trying to return to the version of yourself who existed beside them. His workouts became longer. Not because he loved exercising. Because exhaustion temporarily quieted his thoughts. After lifting weights until his arms trembled, his mind finally stopped replaying conversations. For about an hour. Then, while driving home, he'd see a couple arguing at a stoplight. Or someone holding hands. Or a woman resting her head against someone's shoulder on the subway. The silence returned. His body kept asking questions his pride refused to answer. Where is home? Who do you call when something wonderful happens? Who knows the version of you that existed before this year? Who notices when you're pretending you're okay? His ego answered. You don't need anyone. His chest answered. Nothing. Just a heaviness that arrived without permission. Around this time, he noticed something else. He had begun checking his phone in moments that made absolutely no sense. After finishing a difficult meeting. After watching a funny video. After finding a new restaurant. There was never actually a message from her. His thumb simply moved before his mind did. Habit is one of the body's oldest languages. She, meanwhile, wasn't living some fantasy life. She still had difficult days. She still missed certain memories. She still sometimes wondered how he was doing. Healing hadn't erased affection. It had simply changed its direction. When she felt lonely, she called her sister. She went for long walks. She read. She baked bread that came out far too dense. She laughed about it. She experienced loneliness, without automatically translating it into, I should go back. That distinction mattered. Because missing someone, and abandoning yourself are not the same thing. He didn't know that. From his perspective, she simply seemed steady. That steadiness became strangely magnetic. Not because she was chasing him, because she wasn't. His nervous system kept expecting emotional movement from her. Questions, reassurance, signals. Instead, there was calm. The absence of chasing created space. And in that space, his own emotions became impossible to outrun. One evening, he almost texted her. He opened the conversation. His fingers rested on the keyboard. He typed, "Hey," deleted it. Typed again. "I saw something today that reminded me of you." Deleted that too. Then, without really thinking, he wrote, "I hope you're doing okay." He stared at the screen. That one felt honest. Not manipulative. Not dramatic. Just honest. His thumb hovered over the send button for nearly a full minute. Then, he locked the phone, placed it face down, walked into the kitchen, made tea, came back, read the message again. Still didn't send it. Why? Because the battle was no longer about her. It was about himself. If he sent the message, he would have to admit something. Not necessarily that he wanted her back, but that she still occupied emotional space inside him. His pride wasn't ready for that confession, even if it remained private. Over the following days, he became increasingly aware of a quiet contradiction. His thoughts kept saying, "Move forward." His behaviors kept circling backward. He revisited old places, listened to familiar songs, cooked meals they'd once made together, without intending to. He kept reconstructing fragments of a life he claimed he had already left behind. That's when a realization finally found him. Not suddenly. More like sunrise. Slowly. Almost invisibly. He wasn't obsessed because she had become more mysterious. He wasn't suffering because she had become unavailable. He wasn't haunted because she had disappeared. He was struggling because the emotional reality inside his body had finally caught up to the emotional reality she'd been living for months, while she had gradually learned to carry her own life. He had only recently begun feeling the weight of carrying his. That delay made it seem as though his emotions had appeared out of nowhere. They hadn't. They had simply arrived late. Very late. And now, every ordinary place, every familiar routine, every quiet evening, every unconscious reach toward the empty side of the bed, was teaching him the same lesson. The mind can insist that you're ready to move on. The ego can repeat the words until they sound convincing. But the body keeps remarkably accurate records. It remembers where comfort lived. It remembers whose presence became part of its definition of safety. And until those memories are gently integrated rather than denied, it will continue whispering the truth long after the ego has declared the story finished. Because love doesn't always leave through the front door. Sometimes, it lingers quietly in muscle memory, waiting for the heart to become honest enough to notice it. There comes a point in some relationships where nothing dramatic changes on the outside. The same people, the same apartment, the same conversations, the same routines. And yet, the emotional center of gravity quietly shifts. For a long time, he had been the center of hers. Not because he demanded it. Not because he consciously wanted it. It simply happened. Her schedule bent around his availability. Her mood reacted to his mood. Her evenings depended on whether he wanted company. Her weekends quietly organized themselves around his plans. She rarely noticed it happening. Neither did he. When something becomes your normal, you stop questioning it. One Tuesday afternoon, she leaves work a little earlier than usual. Months ago, her first instinct would have been to text him. Finished early. What are you doing? Want to grab dinner? Now. She pauses before unlocking her phone. She realizes she doesn't actually need to ask anyone what to do with the next 3 hours. So she doesn't. She walks into a bookstore. Not because she's searching for anything specific. Just because she has time. She spends nearly 40 minutes wandering through shelves, reading the backs of novels, laughing quietly at oddly specific cookbook titles, buying a journal she probably doesn't need. No one knows she's there. No one is waiting for updates. For the first time in a long while, her afternoon belongs completely to her. It feels strangely unfamiliar and strangely peaceful. At almost that exact moment, he checks his phone. Nothing. He puts it back into his pocket. 5 minutes later, he checks again. Still nothing. He tells himself he's just checking the time. He isn't. He's waiting for something that used to arrive naturally. Not because she promised it, because she always thought of him first. Now, her attention has become less predictable. And unpredictability has a way of exposing dependency. Dependency often hides inside consistency. As long as someone always reaches first, you never realize you've stopped reaching at all. That evening, she comes home carrying the bookstore bag. He notices it immediately. Oh, you went shopping? She smiles. Just wandered around after work. What did you get? She shows him the journal. A novel. A tiny ceramic bookmark shaped like a leaf. He nods. Looks nice. Then something slips out before he can stop himself. You could have told me. She looks confused. About what? That you got off early. Oh, I didn't really think about it. She says it gently. Not to hurt him. She genuinely hadn't thought about it. The conversation lasts less than 30 seconds. Yet it stays with him all night. Not because she kept a secret. Because for the first time, he wasn't automatically included in the beginning of her free time. Months earlier, she would have waited to watch a new series until they could watch it together. She would have saved funny stories, delayed decisions, postponed experiences, small acts of consideration, small sacrifices. Not because she was forced, because togetherness had become her default. Now, she starts the first episode alone one rainy evening. Halfway through, she realizes he might enjoy it. For a second, she considers stopping, waiting. Then she smiles to herself. I'll just watch it again if he wants to. She continues. It's such a tiny decision, barely worth mentioning. Yet emotionally, it's enormous. Because she's no longer placing her own life on hold in anticipation of someone else's participation. I've noticed something interesting about people recovering from emotional overinvestment. They don't suddenly become selfish. They simply stop delaying themselves. Those two things often look identical from the outside. They're not. One comes from indifference. The other comes from finally believing your own life deserves to keep moving. He begins noticing these moments everywhere. She signs up for a Saturday photography workshop. She starts taking longer walks after dinner. She buys concert tickets with friends before checking his schedule. Not because she doesn't care whether he joins. Because she no longer believes her happiness should wait until everyone else's calendar aligns. Every one of those choices is healthy. Every one of them quietly unsettles him. One Saturday morning, he wakes up expecting her to still be home. The apartment is silent. He walks into the kitchen. There's a note. Gone to the farmer's market. Back around noon. Coffee's already made. A tiny smiley face. That's it. No apology. No explanation. No. I didn't want to wake you. No. Is this okay? Just information. Simple. Respectful. Healthy. He drinks the coffee she left behind. Looks around the quiet apartment. and suddenly understands something. This isn't loneliness. It's unfamiliarity. He's experiencing what she experienced for months. Learning how to enjoy a morning without assuming another person will organize it for you. Around noon, she returns carrying fresh flowers, bread, peaches, a small plant. The apartment immediately smells different. She hums while arranging flowers in a glass vase. He watches her from across the room. She's completely absorbed in what she's doing. Not performing. Not trying to appear happy. Just living. He can't explain why this affects him so deeply. Until a thought quietly forms. She used to look at me this way. With this much attention. With this much presence. Now, she's giving some of that presence back to her own life. Attention is finite. When we stop giving all of it to one person, it doesn't disappear. It returns home. One evening, they're eating dinner together. She mentions she's thinking about taking a weekend trip with friends later that summer. He immediately asks, "When?" She tells him the dates. He quickly calculates them. "You know that's the weekend we usually." He stops. "Usually what?" "Usually spend together? Usually stay home? Usually do nothing in particular?" The sentence never finishes. Because he realizes there isn't actually a tradition. Only an assumption. An assumption that she'd continue revolving around the rhythm they'd always had. She smiles. "If something comes up before then, we can figure it out." Such an ordinary response. Yet it contains something entirely new. She isn't asking permission. She's offering consideration. There's a difference. He begins remembering countless moments he'd overlooked. The vacations she'd postponed because his schedule changed. The birthday dinners she'd quietly rearranged. The hobbies she'd slowly stopped mentioning. The invitations she'd declined without making a big deal about it. At the time, he interpreted those choices as proof of love. Maybe they were. But they were also small pieces of herself she continually placed aside. One by one. Without noticing how many there were. Now, she is quietly picking them back up. A few weeks later, they meet mutual friends for dinner. The conversation flows easily. Someone asks about recent hobbies. Without hesitation, she talks about photography, the bookstore, learning how to bake sourdough, the ceramics she's been making. There's excitement in her voice. Curiosity. She sounds interesting. Not because she's trying to impress anyone. Because she's genuinely engaged with her own life. He notices something unexpected. Everyone else notices too. People lean in. Ask questions. Laugh. Not because she's louder. Because she's more present. Presence attracts attention naturally. Driving home afterward. He feels strangely quiet. She asks, "You okay?" He nods. "Yeah." Then after a long pause, he says something neither of them expected. "I forgot how many things you like." She turns toward him. "What do you mean?" He searches for the words. "I don't know. I guess. I got used to thinking of us. I forgot there was." He gestures vaguely. All of this. She understands immediately. Not because she wants credit. Because she'd forgotten too. For a long time. Both of them had. Healing doesn't always make someone more exciting. Sometimes. It simply makes them visible again. Over the next few days. He starts observing instead of assuming. She still laughs with him. Still asks about his day. Still cares when he's tired. She hasn't become cold. She hasn't become distant. She simply no longer disappears inside the relationship. That's what feels unfamiliar. Not less love. More self. One afternoon. He sees her sitting by the window, writing in the journal she bought weeks earlier. Sunlight stretches across the hardwood floor. She pauses occasionally. Looks outside. Writes another sentence. He almost asks, "What are you writing?" Instead, he doesn't. Somehow, it feels important that she has thoughts which exist without immediately becoming shared property. That realization surprises him, because months ago, he would have unconsciously expected access to every part of her emotional world. Not out of control, out of habit. Now, he recognizes something healthier. Love doesn't require complete possession of another person's inner life. That night, lying awake beside her, he begins thinking about planets. A strange comparison, but it stays with him. For years, he imagined love as two people becoming one center. Everything revolving together. Everything shared. Everything merged. Now, he wonders whether healthy love might look different. Maybe. It's two complete worlds, each with its own seasons, its own weather, its own gravity. Choosing, again and again, to travel alongside one another. Not because they have nowhere else to go, because they genuinely want to. That thought humbles him, because he realizes something uncomfortable. He had slowly stopped noticing her choices. He noticed only her availability. Those are not the same thing. Availability can become expected. Choice never should. Every day she had answered his calls, listened to his stories, adjusted her schedule, shown up emotionally. She had been choosing him. He'd mistaken repetition for permanence. He'd forgotten that every act of love is still an act of freedom. The following weekend, she leaves early for her photography class. Camera over one shoulder. Coffee in her hand. She smiles before closing the front door. "See you this afternoon." Then she's gone. The apartment grows quiet again. He doesn't immediately reach for his phone this time. Instead, he sits in the silence, listening, thinking. For perhaps the first time, he understands what has actually changed. She hasn't moved farther away. She has moved closer to herself. And because she is no longer orbiting around him, he is finally forced to confront the empty space where his own center should have been. For years, her emotional gravity had quietly carried part of his world without either of them noticing. Now that she has reclaimed it, he must learn to stand inside his own life. Not because she abandoned him, but because healthy love was never supposed to require one person shrinking so the other could feel like the center of the universe. The irony is almost heartbreaking. The moment she stopped revolving around him was the moment he finally began to see her clearly. Not as an extension of his life. Not as someone whose love would always arrive automatically. But as a complete human being. With dreams that continued while he wasn't looking. With joy that no longer depended on his attention. And with a life that kept expanding. Even when he wasn't standing at the center of it. And perhaps, that is when genuine longing begins. Not when someone disappears, but when you finally understand. They were never meant to disappear into you in the first place. Most people imagine obsession beginning with intensity. A glance across a crowded room. A first kiss. A sleepless night. An immediate certainty that someone matters. But life is rarely that dramatic. Sometimes, obsession begins after the relationship has already ended. Not because love suddenly appeared. Because awareness finally did. When she was always there. He rarely had to measure her importance. Human beings rarely measure what feels permanent. We notice electricity only when the lights go out. We notice breathing only when something interrupts it. We notice silence only after the music stops. The same is often true of people. Constancy has a strange way of becoming invisible. Not because we don't value it, because the nervous system slowly classifies it as normal. For years, her presence blended into the background of his life. Morning texts, little reminders, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder while he worked. The way she remembered to replace his favorite coffee before it ran out. How she always noticed when he became quieter than usual. None of these moments demanded attention. They accumulated quietly. Like sunlight entering the same window every morning. You don't wake up celebrating sunlight. Until one winter. When the room stays dark. One afternoon. He opened the kitchen cabinet. There were no coffee filters. Without thinking, he reached for his phone. She always remembered. Halfway through unlocking the screen, he stopped. Of course she hadn't forgotten. She didn't live here anymore. He stood in the kitchen longer than necessary. Not because of coffee. Because this tiny inconvenience revealed something much larger. He had confused her care with the natural order of the world. Recognition often arrives disguised as inconvenience. He started noticing dozens of moments like this. His shirts weren't folded quite the way he liked them anymore. Plants on the windowsill slowly leaned toward the light because nobody rotated them every few days. The batteries in the remote stayed dead for nearly 2 weeks. Not because he couldn't replace them. Because nobody quietly handled those invisible tasks anymore. For years, he'd assumed life simply functioned. Only now did he realize. Someone had been making it function. People often think emotional labor is only about feelings. It isn't. It's remembering, anticipating, preparing, preventing. It's seeing tomorrow before someone else has finished living today. When that person leaves, life doesn't immediately collapse. It becomes slightly harder, slightly slower, slightly less held together. Thousands of tiny inconveniences begin introducing themselves. Each one whispers the same sentence. Someone loved you here. His friends noticed he seemed distracted. You okay? Yeah. Just tired. It was the easiest explanation. Because how do you explain delayed recognition? How do you explain realizing someone's value months after they stopped trying to convince you they had it? One Sunday, he decided to clean the apartment. Not because it needed cleaning. Because movement felt easier than thinking. He vacuumed. Wiped countertops. Organized drawers. Eventually, he reached the hallway closet. Inside, on the highest shelf, sat an old cardboard box. He didn't remember putting it there. He climbed onto a chair and pulled it down. Inside were random things. Movie ticket stubs. Travel brochures. A restaurant menu. A faded receipt from a hardware store. A handwritten grocery list. He almost threw everything away. Then he unfolded the grocery list. Milk. Eggs. Rice. Tomatoes. His favorite cereal. Dog treats. They didn't even own a dog. He smiled. She'd written the wrong list by accident. He remembered teasing her about it. You planning for someone else's life? She'd laughed until she couldn't breathe. Standing alone in the hallway. Holding a crumpled grocery list. He laughed again. Then, without warning, his eyes filled with tears. Not because of the list. Because memories don't always return through grand gestures. Sometimes, they enter through handwriting. There is a particular kind of grief that arrives only after enough time has passed. The immediate pain of separation is obvious. Everyone expects that. The delayed grief is quieter. More confusing. Because it appears while life is already moving again. You're functioning. Working. Sleeping. Seeing friends. Then one ordinary Tuesday. You suddenly understand what someone meant to your everyday existence. That realization can feel almost more painful than the breakup itself. Because now, there's clarity. And clarity often arrives after opportunity has already disappeared. Meanwhile, her life continued unfolding. Not perfectly. Not effortlessly. She still had lonely evenings. She still reached for memories sometimes. She still smiled at songs that reminded her of them. But something fundamental had changed. She no longer organized her identity around whether he finally understood her value. Recognition had stopped being her responsibility. That burden had quietly fallen away. Ironically, that freedom made her even more difficult to forget. Not because she became mysterious, because she stopped asking to be seen. There's something profoundly attractive about a person who no longer performs for recognition. Not because they're playing hard to get, because they've become fully occupied by their own life. One evening, he drove past the park where they'd once spent an entire Saturday afternoon doing absolutely nothing. They hadn't planned anything. No agenda. No destination. Just sandwiches. A blanket. Clouds drifting across the sky. At the time, he'd almost considered the day forgettable. Now, it returned with astonishing detail. The warmth of the grass. The sound of children laughing somewhere behind them. The way she'd fallen asleep for 20 minutes with her head resting against his arm. He remembered checking the time repeatedly that afternoon, wondering whether they should leave, whether they should do something more productive. Now, he would have given almost anything to experience one more afternoon exactly like that. Funny, how the moments we rush through become the ones we ache for later. The human brain is remarkably poor at appreciating consistency in real time. Novelty captures attention. Consistency builds attachment. Unfortunately, we often recognize the second only after losing it. He found himself replaying conversations differently now. Not searching for arguments. Searching for meaning. He remembered the night she'd quietly asked, "Do you ever think about us 10 years from now?" At the time, he'd laughed. "We'll figure it out." He thought she wanted reassurance. Now he realized. She had been inviting him into a future. He'd answered with convenience instead of curiosity. Not because he didn't love her. Because he assumed there would always be another opportunity to answer better. There wasn't. Delayed recognition also changes memory itself. At first, he remembered the conflicts. Who said what? Who forgot? Who disappointed whom? Months later, those memories shifted. Not because they disappeared. Because they found their proper size. The arguments were real. But they were no longer the entire story. Now, he could also remember the 1,000 ordinary kindnesses surrounding them. The soup she made when he was sick. The way she'd warm his side of the bed before he came upstairs. How she'd quietly lower the television volume if she noticed he looked tired. How she never forgot his mother's birthday. None of those moments demanded applause. They simply accumulated. Until their absence became impossible to ignore. Recognition matures memory. One rainy afternoon, he sat inside a coffee shop working on his laptop. Across the room, an older couple shared a slice of cake. Nothing remarkable. They barely spoke. The man slid the larger piece toward the woman without looking up. She smiled as though this had happened 1,000 times before. He suddenly understood something. Love isn't always visible in excitement. Sometimes, it's visible in repetition. In ordinary habits repeated so consistently that they disappear from view. Until they're gone. He closed his laptop. Couldn't focus anymore. Walking home, he asked himself a question he'd avoided for months. When did I stop seeing her? Not loving her. Seeing her. Those aren't the same thing. Love can continue existing while attention slowly fades. Affection can remain while appreciation quietly weakens. People don't always stop caring. Sometimes, they simply stop noticing. He realized she had been changing long before she left. Growing. Trying. Communicating. Waiting. Not waiting for perfection. Waiting to feel met. Waiting to feel chosen with the same consistency she offered. He hadn't ignored her intentionally. Life had simply become loud. Work. Stress. Bills. Habits. Routine. He assumed there would always be more time. Recognition rarely feels urgent. Until time quietly runs out. That realization hurt. Not because it filled him with shame. Because it filled him with truth. And truth doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes. It sits beside you in complete silence. Late one night. Unable to sleep. He stood by the living room window watching rain collect beneath the streetlights. The city looked strangely still. Cars passed occasionally. Windows glowed across neighboring buildings. Somewhere, people were laughing. Somewhere, someone was saying goodbye. Somewhere, another couple was probably sitting together without realizing they were living memories that one day might become precious. He wondered how many people fail to recognize love while they're standing inside it. Probably more than anyone wants to admit. Delayed recognition doesn't mean the feelings weren't real before. It means awareness developed more slowly than attachment. One person's realization arrived months after the other person's exhaustion. That's why timing feels so cruel. She had been asking to be seen while she was still beside him. He finally saw her. After she'd already learned how to see herself. And perhaps that is what obsession really is. Not endless thinking. Not constant texting. Not dramatic declarations. Sometimes, obsession is the mind desperately trying to revisit every ordinary moment. Searching for the exact place where appreciation should have arrived sooner. It's replaying conversations with better answers. Remembering smiles you barely looked up to notice. Feeling gratitude that came too late to be received. Because delayed recognition carries a unique kind of ache. You are no longer searching for who they were. You finally understand who they had been all along. And that may be the hardest realization of all. Not that you lost someone extraordinary, but that they had been extraordinary every ordinary day. While you were still calling them ordinary. There is a folder that almost everyone carries. Not on their phone. Not in their computer. Inside themselves. It's filled with conversations that never happened. Questions that remained unasked. Apologies that arrived too late. Words rehearsed 100 times. But never spoken. After someone leaves. This invisible folder grows surprisingly heavy. He tells himself he has accepted it. He's sleeping better now. Work has become busy again. Friends have started inviting him out more often. Life appears normal. From the outside. Everything suggests he's moving forward. Yet almost every evening, his thumb still pauses over her name. Not because he plans to send anything. Because part of him hasn't learned that the conversation is over. The first message appears 3 weeks after they stop talking. He doesn't even realize he's typing. Hey, I drove past that little bakery today. Remember how they always burned the croissants? He smiles. Reads it again. Then imagines her phone lighting up. Imagines interrupting whatever she's doing. Imagines asking her to step back into a version of herself she's trying to outgrow. He deletes the message. Not because he doesn't want to send it. Because for the first time, he wonders whether wanting something is enough reason to ask for it. Growth sometimes begins with restraint. Days pass. The messages continue. None of them survive. I saw your favorite flowers today. Delete. I hope your presentation went well. Delete. You'd love this bookstore. Delete. I miss talking to you. Delete. Every deleted sentence reveals something interesting. His mind no longer reaches for grand declarations. It reaches for ordinary sharing. Because that's what intimacy really was. Not dramatic confessions. Shared moments. Tiny observations. Small pieces of daily life offered to one another. When that habit disappears, the silence feels enormous. Researchers often describe close relationships as creating a shared reality. Two people slowly build a world where experiences feel incomplete until they're shared. You hear a joke and immediately think of them. You discover a new cafe. and mentally save it. You see the first snowfall and instinctively reach for your phone. The habit isn't about dependency. It's about belonging. After separation, the habit remains long after the relationship ends. The body still assumes someone lives inside your everyday experiences. One Friday evening, he stops by the grocery store after work. Nothing unusual. He fills his basket. Pasta, tomatoes, coffee. As he walks toward the checkout, he notices dark chocolate on sale. Without thinking, he reaches for her favorite brand. His hand freezes halfway. He stands there holding the chocolate, looking at it, almost laughing. The cashier asks, "Do you still want that?" He blinks. "Oh, no." He places it back, walks away. The chocolate remains on the shelf, but the feeling follows him all the way home. Love leaves habits behind, sometimes longer than it leaves hope. Late that night, he sits on the couch with his phone beside him. Rain taps softly against the windows. The apartment feels larger than it used to. Not because anything changed physically, because conversations once filled these rooms. Now, silence echoes differently. He opens their old message thread. Not to torture himself. At least, that's what he tells himself. He scrolls upward. Past birthdays. Holiday plans. Memes. Random grocery lists. Pictures of sunsets. Voice notes. Arguments. Apologies. Inside jokes that no longer make sense without context. Their relationship wasn't built through monumental moments. It was built one ordinary exchange at a time. Looking at thousands of tiny messages, he realizes something. Love had never been a single event. It had been consistency. His eyes stop on one message she'd sent almost a year earlier. "Drive safe." Nothing remarkable. 3 words. He barely remembered receiving it. But now, he notices the timestamp. She'd sent it almost every single time he drove home late. Hundreds of invisible acts of care. So ordinary. He'd never counted them. Now, they feel immeasurable. He closes the conversation, puts the phone down, then picks it up again. Not because he's addicted. Because unfinished attachment creates unfinished movement. The nervous system keeps reaching toward what once provided comfort. Weeks later, his birthday arrives. Friends send messages. His parents call. Co-workers leave cake in the office break room. He laughs, smiles, says thank you. But throughout the day, there's one notification he keeps unconsciously expecting. Not because he believes she'll text. Because for years, she always had. Usually before anyone else. Always with something thoughtful. Never generic. She remembered details everyone else forgot. This year, midnight arrives quietly. His phone remains still. He finally understands that traditions can disappear without anyone announcing their ending. Meanwhile, she notices the date too. Of course she does. Memory doesn't disappear because contact ends. For a few seconds, she considers sending something simple. "Happy birthday. I hope today is kind to you." She types it, looks at it, then stops. Not because she wishes him harm. Quite the opposite. She genuinely hopes he has a beautiful day. But she also remembers how difficult it was to create distance. She remembers the nights spent convincing herself not to reach out first. She remembers rebuilding her peace one quiet decision at a time. Sometimes, care means respecting the boundary that healing required. Even when your heart remains kind. She deletes the message. Then quietly whispers, "Happy birthday." To no one. This is one of the least discussed parts of healing. Choosing silence doesn't always mean someone stopped loving. Sometimes, It means they finally started protecting the part of themselves that had been waiting too long. Months pass. The unsent messages become less frequent. But they become deeper. Instead of, "Look what I saw," they become, "I finally understand what you meant." Instead of, "I miss you," they become, "I didn't realize how lonely you must have felt while standing right beside me." Growth changes the language of regret. One afternoon, he finds an old notebook while cleaning. Inside, between random meeting notes, he discovers a list. At the top she had written, "Things we should do someday. Learn salsa dancing. Watch the northern lights. Visit that tiny bookstore by the sea. Take a train without choosing the destination. Plant tomatoes. Cook an entire meal without using recipes." Half the list had tiny check marks. Half remained unfinished. He traces his finger across the page. The unfinished dreams hurt more than the completed ones. Not because they were impossible, because they had assumed time. Time is the invisible promise every relationship quietly believes in. We'll do it later. We'll travel next year. We'll talk after work. We'll fix this next weekend. Most relationships don't collapse because people stop loving overnight. They slowly begin spending tomorrow, before realizing tomorrow isn't guaranteed. That evening, he opens his notes app. Not their message thread. Just a blank page. He starts writing. Not to send. Simply to understand himself. "I thought you would always tell me when something was wrong." He stops. Deletes it. Writes again. "You did tell me." Long pause. "I just kept believing there would be another conversation." He stares at the sentence. For several minutes. Sometimes, truth doesn't need paragraphs. One honest sentence can rearrange years of misunderstanding. Across town, she sits in a cafe by herself. Her journal lies open. Someone at the next table laughs loudly. A dog waits patiently outside beside its owner. Life continues exactly as life always does. She writes one sentence. "I'm proud that I no longer abandon myself to keep someone else comfortable." She closes the journal. Smiles gently. Orders another cup of tea. Then opens the novel she brought with her. The story continues. Not because she forgot. Because she remembered herself. Healing doesn't erase memory. It changes your relationship with memory. Months ago, thinking about him interrupted her entire day. Now, a memory visits. She smiles. Sometimes she cries. Then the feeling quietly leaves again. It no longer owns the room. The memory became a guest. Not a permanent resident. He hasn't reached that place yet. For him, memory still walks through every room of the house. Every song. Every restaurant. Every season. Every ordinary Tuesday. But something has changed. Instead of trying to silence the memories, he starts listening to what they're actually saying. None of them ask him to suffer forever. They ask him to notice. To understand. To become someone capable of loving differently than before. One night, long after midnight, he writes the longest message yet. Not in their conversation. In his notes. "I'm sorry I kept believing you'd always wait. I'm sorry I noticed your absence before I fully noticed your presence. I'm sorry I confused your patience with permanence. You deserve to feel chosen while you were still standing beside me." He reads every line slowly. There are no dramatic promises. No request for another chance. No attempt to convince her to return. Only truth. When he finishes, he doesn't copy it. He doesn't send it. He simply saves the note. For himself. Because some apologies arrive too late for reconciliation. But exactly on time for transformation. Perhaps that is the real purpose of the messages we never send. People often believe they exist because we're afraid. Sometimes that's true. But often, They exist because the person who needed to hear those words no longer owes us their attention. The message becomes something else. A mirror. A confession. A quiet conversation with the version of ourselves that finally understands. And that may be the most painful silence of all. Not the silence between two people, but the silence that follows the moment you finally find the right words, only to realize they belong to a chapter that has already ended. Because some messages are never meant to restart a relationship. They exist to reveal who we've become after losing it. And in that quiet realization, without pressing send, someone can finally begin telling the truth they had spent far too long avoiding. If he saw her across the room today, he might struggle to explain why she feels so different. She still smiles the same way. Her laugh still begins quietly before becoming impossible to hide. She still tucks loose strands of hair behind her ear when she's concentrating. She still tilts her head slightly when someone tells an interesting story. Objectively, she looks almost exactly the same. And yet, something about her feels entirely unfamiliar. People often assume transformation must be dramatic. A different hairstyle, a new city, a completely different personality. But some of the deepest changes are almost invisible. The face remains the same. The voice remains the same. The heart remains kind. Only one thing changes: the direction of her energy. And somehow, that changes everything. Months ago, she entered every room quietly wondering how everyone else was feeling. Was he comfortable? Did he seem stressed? Should she say something? Should she wait? Was he upset? Did she do something wrong? Without realizing it, her attention constantly flowed outward, toward other people, toward keeping peace, toward preventing disappointment, toward maintaining connection. Now, she still notices people. She still cares. But her attention has learned a new habit. It returns home. One Saturday morning, she wakes without an alarm. Sunlight spills softly across the bedroom floor. For a moment, she simply lies there listening. Birds outside. The distant hum of traffic. The kettle beginning to whistle in the kitchen. Months ago, her first instinct would have been to check her phone. Had he texted? Was everything okay? Would they see each other today? Now, her phone remains untouched on the nightstand. Instead, she opens the window. Fresh air fills the room. She waters the small plants lining the sill. Brews coffee. Puts on music. The morning belongs entirely to itself. Not because she's trying to prove independence. Because she has stopped rushing to give every new day away before she's even lived it. This is one of healing's quietest victories. The absence of urgency. Later that afternoon, she meets two friends at a small outdoor market. They wander slowly between handmade pottery, fresh flowers, and local artists selling watercolor prints. She pauses at a stand displaying ceramic mugs. Each one is slightly imperfect. Tiny variations in color. Small fingerprints preserved beneath the glaze. She smiles. They're beautiful. The artist nods. They're handmade. I can tell. She buys one. Not because she needs another mug. Because something about choosing beautiful things for herself no longer feels selfish. Years ago, she might have wondered whether someone else would approve of the purchase. Now, the decision lasts less than 30 seconds. Not because she cares less. Because she trusts herself more. Confidence rarely arrives loudly. It often sounds like fewer questions. Across town, he unexpectedly runs into an old mutual friend. You've seen her recently? Actually, yeah. How's she doing? The friend smiles. She seems really good. He nods. What do you mean? I don't know. She just seems lighter. Lighter. The word stays with him. Not happier. Not prettier. Not more successful. Lighter. as though she'd quietly put something down. He spends the drive home wondering what that means. Then it slowly occurs to him. Maybe what she put down was the constant weight of trying to be enough. There was a time when every disagreement became a personal evaluation. If he pulled away, she wondered what she had done wrong. If he seemed distracted, she searched herself first. If communication became difficult, she immediately looked for ways to fix it. Not because she lacked intelligence, because love had slowly become confused with responsibility. She believed maintaining connection depended mostly on her effort. Healing untangled those ideas. Now, if someone becomes distant, she notices. She cares. She asks. But she no longer immediately assumes responsibility for emotions that don't belong to her. That single change reshapes every interaction. One evening, she's having dinner with co-workers after a long week. The conversation flows easily. Someone asks where everyone wants to travel next year. People begin sharing ideas. Japan, Portugal, Iceland. She mentions a small coastal town she'd always wanted to visit. Another coworker smiles. You should definitely go. I think I will. There was no hesitation. No. Maybe if someone wants to come. No. We'll see what happens. Just a simple confidence that her own desires deserved movement. Not certainty. Permission. Years ago, she unknowingly waited for life to become a shared decision. Now, she understands that companionship enriches life. It doesn't postpone it. Meanwhile, he finds himself remembering the woman she used to be. Or perhaps, the version of her he thought he knew. He remembers how quickly she'd apologize. How often she'd say, "It's okay," even when it wasn't. How she'd rearrange plans without complaint. How she'd quietly absorb disappointment to keep the evening peaceful. At the time, he interpreted those behaviors as personality. Now, he wonders whether they had actually been survival. Growth changes the meaning of old memories. One rainy afternoon, he happens to see a recent photo of her online. Nothing dramatic. She's sitting outside a cafe. Book in one hand. Coffee beside her. A soft smile. No glamorous vacation. No carefully posed picture. Nothing that should make him stop scrolling. Yet he does. For a long time. He studies the photograph, trying to identify what feels different. Finally, he realizes. She isn't looking at the camera. She isn't performing happiness. She appears completely absorbed in her own moment. The photograph wasn't asking anyone to admire her. It simply captured someone existing peacefully. And somehow, that feels more beautiful than any picture he'd ever seen of her. Peace has a strange kind of attractiveness. Not because it's exciting, because it doesn't ask for anything. Psychologists sometimes describe secure people as being emotionally available without becoming emotionally dependent. She doesn't know that definition. She simply experiences it. She can enjoy someone's company without fearing their absence. She can love deeply without abandoning herself. She can miss someone without needing to chase them. She can disappoint someone without believing she's a disappointment. These differences sound subtle, but they completely change the atmosphere around a person. Weeks later, their paths briefly cross. Not planned, not dramatic, just coincidence. A neighborhood bookstore. She stands near the psychology section. He notices her before she notices him. For a second, time folds strangely. She looks familiar enough to trigger years of memories, yet unfamiliar enough that he hesitates. Then she turns. Their eyes meet. She smiles. Warmly. Genuinely. Hi. Hey. Neither of them rushes toward the other. Neither avoids eye contact. There's no bitterness. No performance. Just two people standing inside the truth of what happened. They talk for a few minutes. Work. Books. Mutual friends. Simple things. As they speak, he notices something almost impossible to describe. She listens just as attentively as she always did. She's still kind. Still curious. Still thoughtful. But she isn't leaning toward him emotionally anymore. She's standing beside herself. Every answer comes from someone who no longer needs approval to feel steady. She hasn't become colder. She's become anchored. The conversation ends naturally. It was nice seeing you. You too. She smiles. Then walks toward the register carrying the novel she'd chosen. He watches her leave. Not because he expects her to turn around. Because for the first time, he understands why she feels different. She isn't carrying invisible questions anymore. She isn't silently asking, "Am I enough?" She answered that question herself months ago. He leaves the bookstore without buying anything. Instead, he walks through the nearby park. Children chase pigeons across the grass. An elderly man reads a newspaper beneath a tree. A young couple argues softly over directions before laughing. Life continues around him. He sits on a bench, thinking. He realizes he'd spent months believing she had transformed into someone new. But that wasn't true. She still liked bookstores. Still loved rainy afternoons. Still drank coffee too slowly. Still noticed flowers growing through cracks in sidewalks. Most of who she was had remained beautifully intact. The difference wasn't her personality. The difference was her relationship with herself. Before, she offered herself to everyone else first. Now, she met herself before meeting the world. That realization hurt. Not because she had changed. Because he finally understood how much of her energy had once been spent holding space for everyone except herself. He had loved her kindness, without realizing how expensive that kindness had been. Healing doesn't erase tenderness. It removes desperation. She still loves. She still gives. She still comforts people. But now, those gifts come from abundance instead of fear. She no longer gives because she's afraid someone will leave. She gives because generosity reflects who she is. And if someone cannot meet that generosity with respect, she quietly walks away. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Simply because peace has become too valuable to negotiate. One evening, she returns home after another ordinary day. She places her keys on the kitchen counter, waters her plants, changes into comfortable clothes, pours tea into the handmade mug she bought weeks earlier. Rain taps softly against the windows. She sits by the window reading until daylight slowly fades. Nothing extraordinary happens. No life-changing phone call. No romantic reunion. No dramatic revelation. Just another peaceful evening. Months ago, an evening like this might have felt lonely. Now, it feels full. Not because solitude replaced love. Because she finally discovered that her own company could feel like home. Perhaps that is the greatest misunderstanding about healing. People imagine it creates a completely different person. Usually, it doesn't. It removes the survival strategies that were covering the person all along. The apologizing becomes honest communication. The overthinking becomes clarity. The chasing becomes choosing. The fear becomes discernment. The exhaustion becomes peace. From the outside, she barely changed. From the inside, everything rearranged. And that is why she feels so different. Not because she became someone new. Because she finally stopped abandoning the person she had always been. The same smile. The same laugh. The same gentle heart. Only now, those beautiful qualities are no longer offered at the expense of herself. And perhaps that is what makes her unforgettable. Not that she became harder to love, but that she finally learned how to include herself among the people she had always cared for most. Only then did the quiet strength that had always lived inside her become visible to everyone else. There is one final truth about relationships, one that almost no one wants to talk about. Not because it is cruel, because it is uncomfortable. We like stories where one person is entirely right and the other is entirely wrong. We want heroes. We want villains. We want certainty. But real relationships rarely give us that luxury. Most of the time, two imperfect people simply meet each other with different wounds, different fears, different ways of asking for love. And somewhere between those differences, they slowly lose each other. By now, you might think this story has been about him, about his regret, his delayed realization, his obsession. But that has never been the whole story, because she wasn't perfect either. Healing isn't about proving one person deserved more blame. Healing is about becoming honest enough to see yourself clearly, even when the truth is inconvenient. Long before she learned to choose herself, she made mistakes too. She stayed silent when honesty felt risky. She hoped he would notice what she never fully explained. She expected understanding, without always allowing vulnerability. Sometimes, instead of saying, "I feel lonely," she smiled. Instead of saying, "I'm beginning to disappear inside this relationship," she asked, "Are you okay?" She became fluent in caring for everyone else, while forgetting how to speak for herself. Many people call this selflessness. Sometimes, it's fear. Fear that expressing your needs will make someone love you less. Fear that asking for reassurance will feel like asking for too much. Fear that honesty might change the relationship. Ironically, avoiding honesty often changes it far more. There was one evening, months before everything ended, when they sat together on the living room floor eating takeout. The television was on. Neither of them was really watching it. She wanted to tell him something. She could feel it sitting inside her chest. Heavy. Waiting. Instead she asked, "How was work today?" He answered. She listened. The conversation moved somewhere else. The moment quietly disappeared. Neither of them noticed. Years later, if someone had asked her when things truly began falling apart, she wouldn't choose the breakup. She would probably choose hundreds of evenings exactly like that one. Moments where truth politely stepped aside, to make room for comfort. Comfort is beautiful, until it begins replacing honesty. He had his own blind spots. She had hers. His was assuming love would continue without attention. Hers was believing love could survive without being fully spoken. Neither intention was malicious. Both were costly. People often imagine relationships ending because someone stopped caring. Sometimes, they end because both people cared, but translated love into completely different languages. He believed providing stability showed love. She experienced emotional presence as love. He solved problems. She wanted to feel understood. She anticipated needs. He assumed silence meant everything was fine. Neither person woke up each morning hoping to hurt the other. Yet hurt happened anyway. Because good intentions are not the same as emotional understanding. Months after the breakup, he begins therapy. Not because he hopes to win her back. Because he's tired of repeating the same emotional patterns. During one session, the therapist asks a simple question. When did you first learn that people would always tell you if something was wrong? He pauses. Long silence. Finally, he remembers childhood. His family rarely talked openly about emotions. People became quiet. Then eventually, everything returned to normal. No one explained. No one asked. Problems simply faded into routine. He carried that expectation into adulthood. If she needed something, surely she would keep telling him. He never realized how exhausting it had become for her to keep translating the same pain into different words. Healing often begins, not with blaming our parents, but with recognizing the emotional maps we inherited. Meanwhile, she experiences her own moment of clarity. A friend asks gently, "Why didn't you leave sooner?" She thinks for a while. "I kept hoping he'd become the version of him I saw during his best moments." The friend nods. "And what about the version of you that kept disappearing?" Silence. The question lingers. For months, she had measured the relationship by his potential, rarely by her reality. That realization hurts. Because hope, while beautiful, can quietly become another way of postponing truth. Sometimes, love isn't what keeps people together. Hope does. Hope that next month will feel different. Hope that one conversation will fix everything. Hope that after work gets less stressful. After life slows down. After the holidays. After the promotion. After moving. After next week. Everything will finally become easier. Hope can be healing. But hope without action slowly becomes delay. One autumn afternoon, they happened to attend the same mutual friend's wedding. Neither knew the other would be there. The ceremony is simple, warm, full of laughter. Children run across the grass. An older couple dances before anyone else joins them. The bride and groom exchange quiet vows. Nothing extravagant. Just promises to remain curious about one another. To keep asking questions. To keep listening. To keep choosing. Those words settle deeply inside both of them. Not because they are thinking about getting back together. Because they finally understand something they never understood before. Love isn't sustained by chemistry. Chemistry begins relationships. Attention sustains them. After the ceremony, they briefly speak again. Not about the past. Not about regret. Just ordinary conversation. The weather. The music. How beautiful the venue is. Before leaving, he smiles. "I'm glad you're doing well." She looks at him. "I hope you are too." "I think." He pauses. "I'm learning." She smiles. "I am too." Nothing dramatic follows. No embrace. No promise to meet again. No hidden confession. Only two people acknowledging that growth continues. Even when shared chapters end. As she walks toward her car, she doesn't feel the ache she once expected. Not because he meant nothing. Because he mattered enough to change her. And she no longer needs to erase that truth. He watches her leave. This time, he doesn't imagine running after her. He doesn't picture rewriting history. He simply feels grateful that loving someone forced him to become more emotionally awake. Some people remain in our lives. Others remain in our character. Perhaps that is what closure actually is. Not forgetting. Not replacing. Not pretending the relationship didn't matter. Closure is carrying the lessons forward. Without carrying the weight. Years later, they both become different partners. Not because they discovered perfect people. Because they became more honest people. He learns to ask, "What are you feeling?" Before asking, "What should we do?" He learns that reassurance isn't weakness. Listening isn't passive. Small conversations prevent large distances. She learns to speak sooner. To express disappointment before resentment grows. To trust that healthy love welcomes honesty. Instead of punishing it. She no longer confuses endurance with loyalty. She no longer believes her worth depends on how much she can carry. Neither person becomes flawless. They simply become conscious. That is all maturity really is. Consciousness replacing autopilot. There is one final irony hidden inside this entire story. The thing that made him become obsessed was never her disappearance. It was her return. Not to him. To herself. Because when someone stops chasing, stops convincing, stops shrinking, stops organizing their entire emotional world around another person. Their true shape finally becomes visible. And sometimes, the people around them only recognize their value after the performance of constant availability ends. That realization can feel like obsession, but underneath it, something quieter is happening. Recognition. Recognition of the emotional labor once overlooked. Recognition of conversations taken for granted. Recognition of ordinary kindness. Recognition of daily choices mistaken for permanence. Recognition that love was never guaranteed, only offered, one day at a time. If there is one lesson worth carrying from this story, perhaps it is this: never wait until someone's absence teaches you what their presence was giving you. Notice the text that says, "Drive safely." Notice the coffee already waiting for you in the morning. Notice the way someone remembers how you take your tea. Notice the questions they ask after your difficult meetings. Notice the quiet ways they choose you, long before they ever have to announce it. Because love rarely arrives with fireworks. It usually arrives carrying groceries, remembering birthdays, saving the last piece of dessert, turning down the television when you're tired, reaching for your hand in crowded places, listening to the same story twice because it matters to you. The extraordinary life of a relationship is built almost entirely from ordinary moments. And if you're the one who has been giving more than you've been receiving, may this story remind you of something equally important. Your kindness is beautiful. Your patience is beautiful. Your loyalty is beautiful. But none of those qualities require you to disappear. Real love does not ask you to become smaller, so someone else can remain comfortable. It invites both people to grow, without either one abandoning themselves. Perhaps that's the part no one likes to admit. Sometimes, the relationship had to end, not because the love wasn't real, but because the versions of those two people could only meet each other for so long. Sometimes, the ending is not the opposite of love. Sometimes, it is the beginning of becoming capable of loving more honestly than either person knew how before. And maybe, that is the quiet hope hidden beneath every painful goodbye. That somewhere beyond regret, beyond obsession, beyond silence, beyond all the messages never sent, two people continue becoming better because they once loved each other. Not perfect, not unfinished, simply more awake, more honest, more present. And perhaps, that is the most meaningful ending this story could ever have. Not that they found each other again, but that they finally found themselves. Because in the end, the deepest love story was never about who came back. It was about what each person became after they stopped running from the truth. And that is the kind of transformation that lasts long after every conversation has ended, and long after the silence no longer hurts.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.